It was supposed to be the happiest week of her life. Instead, it became a mystery that would haunt an entire village for 4 decades. On a warm summer evening in 1983, in a small village nestled in the mountains of rural Anatolia, 19-year-old Ayşe disappeared without a trace. 3 days after her wedding, 3 days after she had danced until dawn, her henna-painted hands clasped with her new husband's, her laughter echoing through the courtyard as elderly women ululated blessings for her future. 3 days after she had promised her weeping mother that she would visit every week, that marriage wouldn't separate them, that she would always be close. And then, nothing. Silence. A void that swallowed a young woman whole and left behind only questions, theories, and a grief so profound it seemed to seep into the very soil of the village itself. For 40 years, Ayşe's family believed she had been kidnapped, sold, taken to another country. They imagined her trapped in some distant city, perhaps in Europe, forced into unspeakable circumstances. Her mother, Fatma, spent 4 decades searching, writing letters to authorities, appearing on television programs, begging anyone with information to come forward. She kept Ayşe's wedding dress in a cedar chest, opening it once a year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, breathing in the fading scent of rose water and tears. The village whispered. Rumors multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. Some said Ayşe had run away with a secret lover. Others claimed her husband's family had arranged something sinister. A few insisted she had been seen in Istanbul, in Germany, in places so far away they might as well have been on the moon. But no one knew. No one could prove anything. And as the years passed, the mystery of the missing bride became local legend, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the dangers that lurked in the world beyond their village walls. But Ayşe never left the village. She never made it past the 3rd day of her marriage, and the truth of what happened to her was buried just 200 meters from her childhood home, hidden in a place everyone passed by daily, but no one thought to look. The excavator's blade hit something solid on a Tuesday morning in April 2023. The construction crew was breaking ground for a new community center, a project meant to modernize the aging village and attract younger families back to the mountains. The foreman, a man in his 50s named Hakan, initially thought they'd struck bedrock, but when the operator cleared away more soil, they saw it. The mouth of an old stone well, sealed shut with heavy wooden planks and covered by decades of earth. Probably dry, Hakan muttered, approaching the opening. These old wells are all over the valley, been abandoned since they got running water in the 90s. But something made him pause. The planks weren't weathered like they should have been. They were protected, preserved by the soil that had covered them. And there was something else, a smell, faint but unmistakable, rising from the darkness below. The smell of earth and time, and something that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Get a light," he ordered, "and call the mutar. We need to see what's down there before we go any further." The village headman arrived within minutes, followed by a growing crowd of curious onlookers. News traveled fast in a place where everyone knew everyone, where a stranger's car could spark hours of speculation, where the biggest entertainment was watching whose laundry was hanging on the line. By the time they lowered a flashlight into the well, more than 50 people had gathered around the construction site. The beam of light cut through the darkness, descending 20 meters into the earth. At first they saw only stone walls, moss, and the glint of stagnant water at the bottom. But then the light caught something else, something white, something that looked almost like Allahum, someone whispered. Is that bones? The mutar's hand trembled as he held the flashlight. He'd lived in this village for 68 years. He'd been here in 1983. He remembered Ayşe's wedding, remembered the search parties that had combed through the forests and fields. He remembered Fatma's screams when they'd found no trace of her daughter, remembered how the young husband had sworn on the Quran that he knew nothing, that he'd woken up and she was simply gone. "Don't touch anything," he said quietly. "Call the gendarme. Call them now." The gendarmerie arrived from the nearest town within 2 hours. By sunset, the entire village was cordoned off as a potential crime scene. The well became the center of a forensic excavation that would take 3 days to complete. Specialists from Ankara descended on the village with their equipment, their cameras, their clinical detachment that seemed almost offensive to the locals who had lived with this mystery for so long. Fatma was 87 years old now. Her hair had gone completely white decades ago. Her hands shook constantly from what the doctors called essential tremor, but what she knew was simply the physical manifestation of 40 years of unanswered questions. When the gendarme knocked on her door that Tuesday evening, she already knew, and mother knows. Some part of her had always known. "We found something," the young officer said gently. "At the construction site. We'll need DNA samples. For comparison." She didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears years ago. Instead, she simply nodded and reached for her coat. "It's her, isn't it?" she asked. "My Ayşe, she was here all along." The officer couldn't meet her eyes. "We don't know yet, Anne, but we need to be sure." They extracted the remains carefully, reverently. The skeleton was nearly complete, curled at the bottom of the well in a position that suggested she'd been conscious when she fell, or was pushed. Shreds of fabric still clung to the bones, the colors long faded but the patterns still visible, floral print, the kind young women wore in the early 1980s. On one finger, a thin gold band, a wedding ring. The forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Elif Yilmaz, who specialized in cold cases, examined the remains with a kind of focused intensity that only comes from years of speaking for the dead. "Female," she noted into her recorder, "approximately 18 to 25 years old, at time of death. Multiple fractures consistent with a fall from height. Ribs, left femur, skull. Death would have been not immediate. Possibly took hours. Hours." The word hung in the air like a curse. Ayşe had been alive down there in the darkness, in the cold, in the pain, calling for help that never came, while the village slept above her, while her new husband slept in their marriage bed, while her mother tended her garden just across the field. The DNA results took 10 days. 10 days during which the village existed in a suspended state of shock and morbid curiosity. Old theories were resurrected, old suspicions reignited. Everyone had an opinion about what must have happened, who must have been responsible, why the well had been sealed so thoroughly that no sound could have escaped. And then the results came back. Positive match. The remains were Ayşe Demir, missing since June 1983. Cause of death: trauma from falling approximately 20 meters into an abandoned well. Time of death: somewhere between June 15th and June 18th, 1983. 3 days after her wedding, just as her family had always marked. The day she vanished wasn't the day someone took her away. It was the day she died, alone and terrified in a hole in the ground while her entire world searched for her everywhere, except the one place she actually was. The investigation that followed would tear the village apart in ways the original disappearance never had, because now there were questions that demanded answers. How had Ayşe ended up in a sealed well? Who had sealed it? And most damning of all, who had known? The well had been on property owned by the Yilmaz family, one of the oldest and most respected families in the village. In 1983, the family patriarch had been a man named Ismail, now long dead, but his sons were still alive. His grandchildren ran the local grocery store, the tea garden, the auto repair shop. They were woven into the fabric of village life so completely that accusing them of anything felt like attacking the village itself. But the forensic evidence was damning. The wooden planks that sealed the well had been put in place shortly after Ayşe's disappearance. Soil samples indicated the well had been deliberately filled with earth within days of her death. Someone had known she was down there. Someone had made sure she would never be found. The eldest son, now 76-year-old Mehmet Yilmaz, sat in the gendarmerie station with his lawyer and maintained the same story he'd told for 4 decades. "I knew nothing. My father knew nothing. That well had been dangerous for years. We sealed it because children played in the area. It was about safety." On June 18th, 1983, the detective asked, 3 days after Ayşe disappeared. "That's when you suddenly decided the well was dangerous?" "It was a coincidence. Your property backs up to the Demir family home. Ayşe would have crossed your land to visit her mother. Half the village crosses our land. It's a shortcut. And you heard nothing, saw nothing? A young woman falls into a 20-meter well on your property and screams for help, and no one in your family heard a single sound." Mehmet's jaw tightened. "I was working in the tobacco fields that week, half a kilometer away. My father was elderly. My mother was deaf in one ear. We heard nothing." But his younger brother told a different story. Ahmet Yilmaz, 73, had been wrestling with guilt for 40 years. When the detective questioned him separately, something broke. The words came pouring out like water from a cracked dam. I heard her, he whispered, his face buried in his hands. Allah forgive me, I heard her screaming. It was the morning of the third day after her wedding. I was 33 years old, working in the barn. I heard this sound, this terrible echoing sound. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a dog that had fallen in. But then I heard words. Help me, please, someone help me. The detective leaned forward. And what did you do? I ran to get my father. I told him someone was in the well, and he grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. He said, "You heard nothing. We have nothing to do with this. She was drunk at her wedding. Everyone saw her drinking. She must have stumbled, lost her way in the dark. If they find her on our property, they'll blame us. They'll say we did something. Do you want to spend your life in prison for something you didn't do? So you left her there." I was scared. I was a coward. My father said that she was probably already dead, that the fall would have killed her instantly, that there was nothing we could do. He sealed the well that same day, made me help him, and we never spoke of it again. Not once in 40 years. The confession sent shockwaves through the village. The Yilmaz family, pillars of the community, had let a young woman die, not because they'd harmed her, not because they'd pushed her, but because they were afraid of being blamed for an accident that happened on their property. They'd chosen their own protection over a human life. They'd sealed the well knowing, or at least suspecting, that Ayşe might still be alive down there. The legal implications were complex. Could you charge someone with a crime 40 years after the fact when they hadn't committed murder but had failed to rescue? Turkey's statute of limitations had expired on many potential charges, but the court of public opinion had no such limitations. Families who had been friends for generations stopped speaking. The Yilmaz grocery store closed after someone spray-painted "murderers" across the front window. Ahmet received death threats. Mehmet's grandchildren were bullied at school. The village fractured along invisible fault lines that had always existed but had been papered over with forced pleasantries and shared history. And through it all, Fatma sat in her small house, holding Ayşe's wedding dress, finally understanding that her daughter had never left her, that every day for 40 years she'd been gardening and cooking and living her life mere meters away from where her child lay dead. The well had been visible from her kitchen window. How many times had she looked at that field, never knowing? The funeral was held on a grey morning in May, exactly 40 years, and 1 week after Ayşe had walked to her marriage bed for the last time. The entire province seemed to attend: journalists, distant relatives, curiosity seekers, and people who simply couldn't stay away from the gravitational pull of a tragedy this profound. Fatma stood at the grave as they lowered the small casket, so much smaller than a full-grown woman should be, but bones take up less space than life. Someone asked if she wanted to say something. She shook her head. What words could possibly suffice? What could she say that would encompass 40 years of searching, of hoping, of imagining her daughter alive somewhere in the world, only to discover she'd been here all along, in the dark, in the earth, waiting to be found? But as they began to shovel dirt onto the casket, Fatma suddenly spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. "I used to garden near that field every summer. I'd talk to her while I worked. I'd tell her about the tomatoes coming in, about her cousin's children, about who had married and who had died. I thought I was talking to the wind, to my memories. But maybe—" her voice cracked. "Maybe she heard me. Maybe she wasn't alone all those years, because I was right there, telling her about her life, even though she couldn't live it. There wasn't a dry eye in the cemetery. Even the hardened journalists who had covered wars and disasters and every kind of human tragedy had to turn away. The prosecutor ultimately charged Ahmet Yilmaz with failure to render aid resulting in death. At 73, he faced up to 15 years in prison. But the judge, perhaps understanding that some punishments are administered by conscience long before a court gets involved, sentenced him to 5 years with consideration for his age and his confession. "You've lived with this for 40 years, the judge said at sentencing. "I suspect that's been a harsher prison than anything I could impose." Ahmet nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Every night," he whispered, "every single night I hear her screaming, and I will until the day I die." Mehmet Yılmaz was never charged. Without direct evidence that he'd known Ayşe was in the well, prosecutors couldn't build a case. But he never returned to the village. He moved to Istanbul, cut off contact with his family, and according to those who knew him, spent his remaining years as a ghost of his former self. The well was filled completely and covered with concrete. A memorial stone was placed on the spot with Ayşe's name, her dates, and the simple inscription, "Found at last. May you rest in peace, dear daughter." In the years that followed, the story of the missing bride became something different than it had been before. It was no longer a mystery about a woman who vanished, possibly kidnapped, possibly escaped. It became a story about how fear can turn good people into accomplices to tragedy, about how silence can be more devastating than violence, about how the truth, no matter how painful, is better than decades of not knowing. Fatma lived for 3 more years after they found Ayşe. Friends said those were the most peaceful years she'd had since 1983. Not happy, how could they be? But peaceful, she finally knew. She could finally stop searching. She could finally grieve properly instead of existing in that terrible limbo between hope and despair. When Fatma died in 2026 at the age of 90, they buried her next to her daughter. Her tombstone faced Ayşe's, and neighbors reported that the old woman had made one final request before her death. "Tell her I never stopped looking. Tell her I never forgot. Tell her I'm sorry it took so long." The village eventually healed, the way villages do. New families moved in. Children who hadn't been born when Ayşe disappeared grew up knowing her story only as something their parents talked about, in hushed tones. The memorial stone became a place where people left flowers on wedding anniversaries, a reminder that some loves endure even beyond death, even beyond time, even when the bride never got to grow old with her groom. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, when the wind blows just right across the mountains, older residents swear they can hear it, a sound like laughter, like ululation, like a young woman dancing at her wedding, free at last from the darkness that held her for so long. Ayşe finally came home. It just took 40 years for anyone to realize she'd never left.